Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
I want to talk about the QBR because we spoke a lot off recording about how much of a fan you are of the QBR in recruitment and talent acquisition. But I would guess there's a fair few people listening to this who might not even be familiar with what a QBR is or haven't done one before. So in the context of recruiting, like what is a QBR and why do you like them so much?
No, I like them a lot. Yeah, I don't know if any listeners have kids here, but there's, parent-teacher conferences, back-to-school night. That's the time to talk about the broader picture of what's going on with someone's kid. And you don't talk about a missed homework assignment or what happened in class. You talk about like the direction and grades and the big picture. And, teachers and parents don't get a ton of time to talk to each other. Even less, I would say, is recruiting executives and the rest of the executive team. And so these are, four guaranteed times to present the status or the service of recruiting to a broader audience. And so making the most of that time is like really your 15 minutes to give this team a real taste of what you're about, the strategy you bring to the table, the things that are important to the recruiting service, the accountability that you want them to bring to their teams, etc. And there's no other time where you're going to get the floor for as much time as you will in a QBR. So really making the most of it is kind of the difference between a great recruiting exec and someone who's getting the job done.
Nice. And I want to get into how you think about what to include and how to communicate it. And you've got this great analogy, which is like the climate versus the weather in recruitment data. So maybe we could start there, run through what that is.
Hopefully you're into the climate conversation in a way that talks about like climate over time or the way the trends of temperature and other factors within climate. But the idea of climate versus weather is you're not using this time to speak about individual things that are important to one person or one process, however tempting it may be. Like these conversations, I'm sure everyone's been in one where that you brought a whole presentation and the one hire you're supposed to make is the conversation everyone wants to talk about. But to the extent that you can avoid that and address the broader picture is the climate conversation. So instead of it being like, I need my hire right now, it's what was the recruiting team's capacity versus what was the demand that you asked and how do we navigate any delta between capacity versus demand. And instead of talking about a specific offer, it's talking about offers and where offers sit as it relates to the budget or to the culture. And same with cost. So a lot of folks will talk about an individual offer, but trending on the entire budget instead of talking about an individual process or candidate funnel, talking about conversion rates. And instead of talking about like one experience that people want to talk about, talking about the trends of experience. And so a lot of times the individual conversation is about the outlier and the QBR is about the theme. And so getting people away from the polarizing, it went so well or it went so bad into this objective assessment of performance relative to these like more large scale metrics. And so, whenever I coach people through the QBR session, it's about just like the one hire shouldn't really influence the one QBR. The one QBR isn't your whole story as an executive. You need to build a reputation over time of how you objectively measure data and show these trends Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, 22, 23, 24, 25, and FY 2026. So building that reputation that you come with objective data that you can then map the trends, and you're happy to address those questions and dive into the weather, but you're really keeping it focused on like what is the big picture and how are we doing, and it's aligns you to finance, aligns you to workforce planning, and it's just a much more mature conversation to be having in an executive environment.
Yeah, I think you've kind of covered my next question in that answer, but so let's say you get this time in the diary and it's like you said, maybe only 15, 30 minutes with the exec team. Like what do they care about coming into this meeting? Like what do you think they want to get out of the 30 minutes with you?
In this conversation, everyone's gonna care about the thing that's important to them right now. And so preparing for that meeting by addressing all of the concerns or wins from the right now is like the pre-work. Then when you get into the meeting, you can talk about the things that are going to be the levers and executive pulls to maximize the production of their environment, regardless of the headcount that they have. And so you can talk about budget, so trending over budget or under budget. One of the most critical things that I've always tracked and now is automated in Headcount 365 is in-year prorated tracking. So managers will move dates around, and because the salary is the same, they'll claim it to be the same cost to the business. But as a recruiting leader and a finance leader, you know that a start date change means we're going to pay someone earlier or later. And so managing that side of the budget as well as the annualized budget is one major piece in the budgetary conversation. The next piece, and kind of related, is change. And how does the variance of what you thought you were going to hire versus what you actually hired impacted either the financials, the culture, the recruiting team, etc. And so as an executive, you want to know if one of your managers is empire building, right? We consulted when I had a consulting firm, we had a customer where the director of marketing, or excuse me, the VP of marketing just hired all direct. No matter what their headcount was, they just hired all directors. Everyone was a director, and it became a huge problem for the rest of the team who was trying to either qualify their IC hires or qualify their director hires. They had this comparison of, well, everyone on that team's a director. They don't have any management reports, et cetera, et cetera. So, the idea that you're going to have variance to what you've hired is a key indicator, not only of budgetary performance, but it's what we call cultural debt, especially if those changes are happening during the recruiting process. So every time you change an offer at the negotiation, you are adding the urgency and the pressure of an offer to up the compensation, to up the title, to up the level. That is, essentially a high stress change that you might not be considering the larger business context to do so. So as a recruiting executive, I would always bring, what is the budget difference? What is the level difference, the salary difference, the title differences, so that we had a proactive look at our accrual of what I called cultural debt, or this idea that you're borrowing against the culture of the business to achieve an outcome for recruiting or the business today. Right? So I would identify all of those things up front, and then I would try to get in front of what's coming next and say, like, this is how I foresee the next quarter to go using those same stats. And then I would make a suggested action plan. So here are the things that you should do in order to get in front of these types of things. And if it's a comp issue, you can bring in the comp team for them to relook at some of the values, or you could train a manager. If someone's funnel is moving slower, you can get that executive on board for actioning recruiting as much more of a priority. So on and so forth. So I try to bring executives I try to pre-work with information that is going to clear the space for me to have a conversation about climate versus weather. And then I bring to them the things that they can go take to their team to then deliver accountability that improves the speed, the conversion, the budget, or the culture from the recruiting service.
Yeah, nice. Because if I understand correctly, like a key part of what you're doing here is almost communicating the ownership in the hitting the target or not hitting the target, right? I've heard you speak a lot before about there's some things recruiting control and don't control, right? And like recruiter performance is clearly one you do control. Hiring manager performance and hiring manager changes to recs, which impacts your ability to hit targets, you don't control. So that's a key part of what you're looking at here.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a team sport. So recruiting doesn't just live, if we back it up, right, the reason why I created Headcount 365 was because the burden of recruiting performance falls today solely on recruiters. So if a hiring manager asks you to fill a role today, by July 7th, it's nearly impossible in most locations to find someone, have them quit, and start another job within 6 days. However, if you miss that start date, that context is coming back to that recruiter like, oh, you didn't fill this role on time. And so the QBR is a place for you to say, okay, I've taken it on the chin for every miss in the, if we're making the climate weather analogy, every time you brought up something in a specific context, we're there. But here's the trend of what's happening. Here are the behaviors that I think can change to prevent this in the future, because ultimately this noise or this clash at the recruiter hiring manager level is not nearly as important as the budgetary impact that it has. So like when you make a workforce plan or you make a sales plan or a revenue plan, you're expecting people to start on time. The whole point of recruiting is to increase the production or the revenue of the business on a schedule that coincides with a plan where the rest of the business operates. So you make a sale, you have an account team, you make production, you review that account, et cetera, et cetera. If that sale doesn't happen when you think it would happen, the rest of that stuff is also delayed. And so those are the types of things that you have to communicate to an executive team the impact of the work that we're doing. If you get better with my team and me, you will have what you want more predictably in the future, which is what we're all here to do.
Yeah, you've got a great graphic, and maybe we can pull it up on the video of different metrics execs are thinking about during the QBR, and the accountability one is probably what we discussed now. But you've also got OPEX impact, production impact, revenue impact, brand, and opportunity costs on there. Like, these are some metrics which a lot of TA teams probably aren't tracking or thinking about. Like, which ones of these would you really suggest everyone pulls out, and how do you start tracking them, maybe if you're not already?
Yeah, so on Unicorn, so Unicorn is the community that I run that takes things like the QBR or other materials and delivers them to either IC recruiters or recruiting leaders trying to grow their career. We have a QBR on there that has all of the different metrics that I would calculate and in the order that I would do them, so that you have a narrative across your QBR. And then once you have 4 of those, you can make a nice annual review, and you can then contribute to the workforce plan for the following year. But I typically work backwards from the result that the executive cares about, right? So if you're talking to sales is always the easiest because there's this quantifiable revenue that comes from sales, and sellers have a ramp time, and revenue has a very quantifiable metric to it. But the same thing applies to engineering or product with engineers. So in order to meet the goals that someone wants to achieve for their part of the plan, they have to have people. And so I work backwards from whether or not they're hitting or missing those goals, and what I think the root cause of that hit or miss is, and how we can contribute. And so it's typically about production impact or revenue impact. So, if you got the hires that you had on time, then you were able to meet those goals. Conversely, some of the more strategic recruiting execs outside of the QBR are having the conversation about, okay, for this sales plan, you needed X amount of people. We did or didn't hire them. Did you still meet your goals? And as AI becomes more prevalent, that is a more fluid conversation about like productivity per worker. So as we look at the trend of recruiting capacity versus demand, as recruiters use AI scheduling, AI sourcing, AI email follow-ups, AI interview notes, can they hire more hires per month, therefore increasing the production per recruiter, therefore reducing the number of recruiters you need to meet the demand? That same, I know we're talking to a recruiting audience here, but that same concept happens for sellers, for engineers using Copilot, et cetera. So what you're going to see, especially I would say the next 6 to 12 QBRs are going to be tremendously insightful as you produce information for your workforce planning team about what is actually needed to meet corporate demand, given all these innovations in productivity. And so that'll be an active conversation about, yes, I did or didn't hire my people, and here's what I was able to produce with this group of employees.
Nice. So let's say you get a time in the diary, you pull together all these insights, maybe you use the free template you mentioned, and you present the sort of findings. How do you turn these into actions, right? Because I assume that's the whole point of doing this is to get buy-in or to agree actions with these stakeholders. How do we do that?
Yeah. So I essentially bucket things into 4 groups, right? So when you have a workforce plan or a headcount plan that the recruiting team is trying to deliver on, you either did or you didn't hit it. And most of the conversation for recruiting, like the service is going well, unfortunately you're talked about for a shorter period of time. There's less deep dive to fix it because people think the service is going well. If things are not going well, you want to be able to clearly articulate if the problem is that the recruiters are underperforming, the funnel doesn't have enough volume or conversion, the business kept changing their plans, or there's a financial planning or business planning aspect to it, or the hiring managers are not holding up their end of the deal. And so I try to identify the metrics that highlight these as problems and focus in on those metrics. So a very popular recruiter metric is offer to accept rate, or time to fill or time to hire, one of those. And so if you see a recruiter that's not performing up to those standards, then that's something that I would then action plan to correct. Similar with funnel performance, I have a whole article on Unicorn called The Science of the Recruiting Funnel. Each from source to application to first interview to hiring manager interview to on-site to offer to accept, all of those conversion rates tell you a story. And so if you have either too much time in one part of the funnel or a low conversion rate, there are clear actions you can take to diagnose and then fix that problem. As a function of business planning, this is what Headcount365 aims to solve. It's I actually just published an article today, right at the end of June when we're filming this, about year-over-year headcount plan tracking. So when you look at your headcount plan at the beginning of the year, so how's the target in the target to goal of recruiters getting their work, every single business I've ever met has headcount hubris, right? Like, oh, I gave you 100 plans, 100 hires. We're only going to do 100 hires this year. It's going to be exactly what the plan is. Everyone knows that day one, year one, and then it changes. So there's something called plan change rate. So you thought you were going to hire 100. Would you actually hire? And what was the distribution of that planning? So if I have the recruiting capacity to make 100 hires per year, and the business gives me 100 hires, great. But if those 100 hires are all slated to start January to March, we're in trouble. That's a lot different of a capacity demand story. And then the last thing, hiring manager interference. This is how many times does a hiring manager get in the way? And so, again, in the world of climate versus weather, don't call out individual managers. Talk about time to interview. Talk about how many times a hiring manager made a change to a requisition while you were working on it. Or, you can look at plan change rate by hiring manager and see which hiring manager is changing your target. And all of these things are how you kind of drive accountability with this other team. So if it's recruiter performance, I own that. If it's funnel performance and it's my team, same. If it's the other team, I'll give them coaching about how to be better with intake sessions, interview rubrics, making it a priority, giving them calendar recommendations, whatever it is. And in the worst case, kind of escalating to the executive to try to get some sort of pressure that's not myself by getting the buy-in from that executive. From the business planning, I'm just trying to give them better metrics from headcount performance. I think this is, I wouldn't have created a software around it if I didn't believe in it as a recruiting leader myself, but I think the recruiting team has a tremendous amount of information that is missing from the workforce planning process about what did you give us versus what did we produce? How did the changes impact that production? How did all that production impact OpEx and revenue? And how can we make a more accurate workforce plan going forward? And so I always recommend Headcount365 to get through that piece. And then from a hiring manager interference perspective, this is coaching for hiring managers. Show up to interviews on time. Give me a Calendly that always sticks. Fill out your scorecards, whatever it is. So I'm trying to make these different action plan recommendations and then taking partner in those executives who are invested in getting, again, that predictable revenue and OpEx from a hire on time.
Love it, man. You got into some stuff there which are like actual actions for ICs as well. And I think, most of this conversation's probably been more for like senior folks in TA or whoever's leading the TA function in certain orgs. You've managed and coached a lot of recruiters during your time at Uber, Bird, etc. How have you helped recruiters like develop this more commercial mindset? Because I think it's something which is missing from a lot of TA teams and individuals, and something which is quite important.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is a top-down culture that's built. So in the way I think about it, the way my peers think about it, is that the QBR it is essentially the consolidation, especially the recruiter performance side, of all of the performance reviews of the recruiting team. So as an IC recruiter, your scorecard is what drives the QBR. So if all of the recruiting team is meeting their goals and the QBR from the recruiting side should go well, and if the business is missing if the business is missing their goals, then it's a function of something outside of that performance review. So if I'm talking directly to an IC, the things that are in the QBR are the things that you should be doing in your scorecard. Now, pre-Headcount365, I would have all of my recruiters maintain the variance that they've encountered in their spreadsheet. So how many times were recs added, backfills added? What was the context for that change? How many total changes happened to it? Was there a financial impact? Was there a start date impact? Right? And trying to capture the information that Headcount365 now automates via the intelligence that we're capturing from the activity, but manually tracking that, because you're providing the context just like a recruiting leader is providing context for the service of recruiting. You're providing context for the service of your performance to the recruiting service. And so if you've hit your goals, you're probably in a great spot. If you're missing your goals, you want to provide the context as to, it was the funnel, it was my fault, and this is what I need to work on. It was a hiring manager, and these are the points of evidence that I have against that. And so you can take the same information that we're then kind of, I want to say, curating for the executive audience, and you can then curate that for your individual recruiting leaders so that, again, during performance time, you know where you stand, and then that translates up to the executive team.
Nice. So I guess there's two parts to that. There's one, like taking complete ownership of like your performance as a recruiter and understand like not just, you know, what have you achieved, but what is your activity meant to the business. Would you then encourage recruiters to like get access or push for access to that like bigger picture and how their performance feeds into the overall story that's been told to the business?
Yeah. So in Headcount365, we have a transparent recruiter scorecard. So the things that I've reviewed in the Mastering Recruiting Performance lesson, on the blog, etc., are automated and transparent that take these objective metrics, not only from the ATS and the funnel, but from the context of the work that you've had pre-funnel. So between the finance team saying we needed 100 roles, and yeah, there might be 20 in the ATS right now, there's 80 that we know might happen. And in that time, they have different job levels, they have different salaries. There's, you know, a job title might be brand new to the business and never recruited before, and so that recruiter has to go do an intake session, interview rubric, job description, calibrate, get it comped. And so in our scorecard, we're taking all of the context of the workload, the hiring manager behavior, the planning behavior, and we're consolidating that into a story where you have less nuance to lobby for performance that isn't actually delivering results. And so, you know, two recruiters who filled 10 jobs each didn't do the same amount of work, no matter what, unless they're, you know, working the exact same title for the same manager. Like you know, you have 100 evergreen customer service recs or something, you got two recruiters, they might be doing the same thing. But for the most part, everyone else has different managers, different personalities, different meetings, different changes, different plan change rates. And so as a individual recruiter, what you're doing is you are taking your performance relative to your North Star metric, usually production, and you're using other information to provide context for that production so that you not only can present yourself well as a performance review, but you're giving a foundation for that QBR conversation to stand on. You're essentially guiding your leader to get the external buy-in for things like hiring manager accountability or budget accountability, etc. And so that's the beginning. So as a talent partner or a recruiter that's shifting more to a strategic person, you're just delivering that context and then taking it for yourself and for the review.
Awesome. Where do you recommend folks go to learn more about these kind of performance metrics and the headcount planning process?
Yeah, so I think there's a ton of free stuff on unicorntalent.com. That's a great resource for recruiters to just come up to speed on a lot of these concepts, including the QBR and the recruiter performance scorecard and the funnel conversion rates. If you're a company that is looking to take some of these concepts and automate them and replace the spreadsheets that you currently use to manage this information, definitely check out Headcount365. That has taken a lot of these concepts and the intricacies of recruiting workflows, and it's attached a machine learning component to it so that we can track the behaviors that create the variance. We can automatically track the variance, and we can summarize it into a story that each individual recruiter, like, I know it's a popular trend right now, you pop, you know, your LinkedIn or something into ChatGPT, you're like, hey, how am I doing? Well, imagine porting all of your sync meetings, all of your recruiter master spreadsheets, all of your performance reviews into this, you know, ChatGPT like analysis of how you're doing. And that's what we aim to produce so that everyone knows exactly where they stand. And it's not a subjective conversation about how hard your work is or how brutal your hiring managers are. It's, oh, I worked all these different director roles that were brand new to the business for this manager that never would show up to interviews and always change what they were looking for. What did you do? And it's a much more concrete conversation about, you know, what does performance actually look like? And, you know, that's what I would recommend people take a look at.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Eric. I think between us, we've got a ton of free resources, so we'll link some of those in the description, and we'll call it there. Thanks for coming on.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe.